Karen said is in terms of Parson School of Design Associations, because Patricia was the associate chair or administrator of the MFA program at Parsons when Jack Heliker was a visiting critic there. So, and Patricia, it is Patricia's perseverance that put together the Heliker-LaHotan Foundation and made this wonderful artist residence there. And I hope that some of you will get out there to see when they have the open studios to visit. It's a pretty remarkable place, and it is a fulfillment of what Jack Heliker wanted done with his home and his estate. Now, I would just like, and when Karen asked me if I would do a talk, I said fine, but then I thought about it, and one of my real principles is not to show slides and do a talk when there are real paintings available. And so here we sit in the middle of Heliker's Cranberry Island world. And the other reason, thing that I said was I really wanted to do a conversation with Patricia because she had a much more personal, over many years, knowledge of Heliker, and she visited many times on Cranberry Island, and she can tell you a lot about the whole background that I don't know. I will talk more about Heliker and the art world in general, and I might just start out by saying that it's so exciting to see this show. I mean, this is really, to me, a museum quality exhibition. And Heliker, although it's his later years on Cranberry, there's much that refers back to his long involvement with art and the showing of art and the making of art in New York and elsewhere. So it's a pretty exciting show. And one other thing I'll say at the start is that the first time that I saw a Heliker painting was in 1951, when the Museum of Modern Art finally acknowledged that there was an American sort of avant-garde abstract art. It had been going on in America for many years, but the museum was always European-oriented, and in this show was a small Heliker abstract painting. Very geometric in its layout, but it also referred to walls and streets and pavings and so forth in Italy, where he was working at the time. So I mention this because it will help to set the kind of basis for his work, which went through a number of different phases. One, social realism in the 1930s. He did political cartoons for the new masses, and his work reflected some of the political concerns of the day, and also regionalist painting. And he lived on a farm in Vermont, and there are many, many drawings of that setting. And then in the 40s, when the European refugees, particularly the Surrealists, were here in New York, there was a Surrealist phase to his work. And then he was in Italy on a Prix de Rome. He arrived there in 1949 and shared a studio with Philip Guston, and they became very close friends. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Guston's work, but Guston was in transition from very surreal representational work that he had been doing in the 30s and 40s, and during that year in Rome, he became an abstract painter. Heliker had been already doing abstract work and was kind of, could have gone either way. And as I said in the catalog, one would have liked to be a fly on the wall and hear the dialogues that went on between these two artists, because that year, 1949, 1950, was a watershed year in American art. Nothing was ever the same afterwards. So, in any case, I think that when Heliker left Europe and was more in the United States and acquired the place on Cranberry, his work then went back to being more representational, but it's always with a very firm sense of order and abstract kind of order underlying it, even the way he puts the paint on. So now I would like to ask Patricia some questions about her friendship with Heliker and the time she spent on Cranberry Island when he was still alive.
Well, if I may, I just want to say how extremely pleased I am to see Martica again. She was very instrumental in helping us form the foundation. She was on our board in the early years for, oh, I don't know, 7 or 9 years, something like that. And so it couldn't have happened without her. She's also a lifelong summer resident in Harpswell, and so her connections in Maine are as good as her, well, her outstanding ones in New York. And so she's been an ideal advisor and helper, assistant for us in this effort to create an artist residency program out of this property. Bob and Jack, as we know them, many of you may know them better than I did, or knew them longer than I did, perhaps. John Heliker and his life partner Robert LaHotan bought an old ship captain's house, the Enoch B. Stanley boatyard and house on Cranberry Island in 1958, I believe. And they spent a half a century painting there and did some of their best work there, both of them. They would go back to New York and have alternating shows at Courthouse Galleries in New York every other year, but painting all the time, all summer long on Great Cranberry. So that's what brings us here, actually. Right?
When was the first time that you went to Cranberry?
Oh goodness, you know, I'm not sure about that. I figure it must have been at least 20 years ago, during the later years. Now, I first met Jack when I came to Parson's School of Design to teach in 1979, I think, 1980. And it was a brand new program in painting, MFA program. And Heliker came there to join the faculty that included Paul Resica and Leland Bell. So the three of them were the master teachers.
Do you remember much about his teaching? I took parentheses. Both my first husband and my daughter studied with Jack Heliker, and I asked my daughter what about his teaching. Can you say at the time? And she really couldn't say any kind of dogmatic thing that he put forward as a teacher. She said he was just very supportive. She said feeling him standing there next to you in your work gave you a kind of confidence and so forth. So I don't know if that was what you found in his teaching.
I think he was one of the most compassionate people I know and knew, and he was a real introvert. So he particularly was sympathetic to the students who were introverts also, and would draw them out. Some of the other teachers were much more extroverted, and Jack meant a lot to those students who were the introverts. But most of the students said, you know, well, he never really taught, you know, and he would mostly engage them in conversation in front of a painting that they were supposed to be showing them, and he would talk about Rome. I mean, he was already almost 80 years old at this point, and a lot of his reveries were about walking in Rome. And so he would talk to the students about his favorite places in Rome, and the students would say then, after a long time of listening to him talk about Rome, which maybe they'd never seen, right? He would say, now, what about that part over there in the painting? Are you going to do something with that? And of course, it would be the very thing that needed attention, that was the weakest part of the painting. They said always he knew it, but he didn't come in and say that part's terrible. You know, he worked up to it gently so that they felt supported, as you said. So that's what he was like.
So Patricia, during your time on Cranberry, I don't know if you actually watched him work or if you were aware of his procedure, because from what I understand, he did not go outside and set up an easel and paint clam diggers on the shore. He would absorb the atmosphere and observe very carefully and think about it, and then he'd go back to his studio and paint. That's what I've been told. Is that?
That's true. He was very much a studio painter. I think through all the years that he painted, and when he first started out, he only had a little bedroom that he painted in, but he worked as a studio painter. But he's written about that. There's some statements in here about he says. Although during the first 2 or 3 years on Cranberry, I have been less particularly concerned with the landscape as subject, I still feel that the time I spend here is richly rewarding. Arriving there in the early spring after the long winter with all its tensions makes me feel more alive. I feel at home and I do my best work there. And he talks about, he goes, what he's after is a sensation of being in the landscape. He really, he will sometimes take a sketchbook out with him, and there are many, many sketchbooks, and but he rarely worked directly in the landscape at all. He made a notation maybe in the landscape, but the role of memory in his work is very powerful throughout his entire career. I think from the very beginning. I was looking at a journal that he kept in the 1930s, Martica, and he's talking about memory there.
Really?
Yeah. So even early on.
Would you want to read a little more of that letter that you were reading to me? You know what I mean?
Well, that's a little bit later, of course. It comes in 1951 again.
Mm-hmm.
You have it there? Yeah, I do have it here. I also, where's also?
Because it says so much about what he really was after in his work, whether he was painting in abstract or representational mode.
This is a bit more about his what happened when he's in New York at the moment that abstract expressionism is taking place, because he certainly had a lot of recognition. He had this is 51. And he's part of this abstract painting and sculpture in America, which is interesting to look at because there's very little abstract expressionism in this show. I think Pollock is in the show.
No, the show culminated with abstract expressionism. I was working at the museum at the time, so I have that show very clearly in my head. Right. The last film in the show, big Pollock, I forget which number, but it had the hand prints across the top, a big Rothko, an abstract Guston.
There's no de Kooning.
Yes, no, de Kooning was there. Yes, there was a de Kooning.
Was there?
Oh, yeah.
It's not listed
it was either excavation or night forms, big black.
Yeah, black and white.
So that was what was happening. That was really the at the time the sounding or the founding salvo of abstract expressionism. So and you have Heliker in that same show, right? Ways that their paths diverged, and where he was really concerned with having a kind of order. He really liked that feeling of order, balance, harmony, and he found the abstract expressionists as time went on too chaotic, and so he moved in a very different direction. Did you find the letter?
So I think, yeah, I have the letter here, which is from 1951. It's a letter to Easton Pribble, who was in Rome, and he's writing to Pribble, and it must have been perhaps even not so long after the show it was hung. I'm not sure when it was, but he says this winter has been trying. He always finds the winter trying, and when he gets to Maine, he's happy again. So since here one works under constant strain, that means New York. Last summer's experience sustained me a good part of it, though, and finally I had the show, which ends Saturday. So he's had a show in 1951 in New York at Croucher. There were 20 paintings, and miraculously all have been sold but 4. Okay, so he has a lot of recognition. It was quite an experience for me, not because of the sales, but the reaction of the ones who saw it. The attendance has been tremendous. Even some of the avant-garde have succumbed. Richard Lippo wrote me a beautiful letter about the show. one that I will always treasure. And yesterday a very good painter bought one. I was very amused by the reaction of one, a great admirer of de Kooning, who said, "It's the same thing, absolutely the same thing that you and he are doing." Well, that's all interesting, but I wonder. During the show, I think this is most interesting for any of you who might be artists yourself. During the show, I received a Guggenheim, which I'm postponing until 1952. And so you see, it was a successful venture in a way. But finally, one realizes that living and working has nothing to do with all that. One desires success, very much, I suppose, and one gets it. And then what? Absolutely nothing. For one must maintain a reality. Little inflated egos or joy for the honor givers and vice versa. But I feel now that the honors have been given, one evaluates them, that their reality is nil, that one loves one's work or not, that one is impelled to do it or not. If he cannot go on without the honors, he is not worth his salt. And that's how it is. One is impelled to do what one does by faith. Every stroke of the brush is by faith, by conviction. One must love one's work above all else. As a painter, one must intensely relate his experience of the past to the present. So I think that Jack's turned back toward figuration in the 60s. I believe that's when it happened. I mean, he comes, you know, he has a major retrospective at the Whitney Museum in 1968. It's an important show. He and Noguchi headlined the opening of the Whitney, which was new that year. And then, you know, he has come to Maine a decade before that happened. So he's been coming to Maine since 57, 58, so a whole decade before his major retrospective. It's interesting. There's no question that coming to Maine changed his work. You know, I think that this letter to me, what this letter showed me, was that his choice of a return to figuration into the landscape as a subject matter, which was certainly influenced by Maine to some extent, though, as you say, he never went out and set up his easel. He's not a literal painter, ever. These paintings are about a sensation of being in the landscape, some feeling that he got, and he talks about that. He talks about going out and trying to come back into the studio and sustain that sensation that he had of the landscape. I think this letter for me, and he goes on to talk about how he feels some of the Pollocks and Rothkos they're lax to him. He feels they don't self-express structurally or formally. And he says, "I'm sure I'm not a Philistine, but I find myself unable to accept it. I'm convinced of this. I know the work, and for me, they're false in relation to what I believe to be a tradition. I have no doubts about tradition. I want to love the world, to not deny it. There's so much to hate, to loathe in it. But one who's an artist can contain himself. His function is to distill, to order, to present life's virtue not in disorder, to present its horror." And then he talks about spring again. Spring is happening, so he's again moved by the seasons. So anyway,
Do you remember his talking at all about Cézanne?
Well, you know, Cézanne was one of the first influences in his work. It's something you can see even in these later works. There's no question about that. He talked more about Bonnat, quite frankly. That was, you know, one of the artists he loved. But Cézanne was one of his first influences. And there are other paintings of bathers which have to have been directly influenced by the painting of the bather that's in the Museum of Modern Art by Cézanne. But you know, when he was a young man, he dropped out of high school at the age of 15. His mother, he's the only child, only child, of older parents, which is maybe where part of his introspection comes from. And his mother allowed him to go to the Metropolitan Museum on the train from Yonkers, where they were living. And so that's where he said he got his real education. And he was there copying from the works in the museum one day when there was another artist copying Manet's Boy with a Sword. And this artist said to him, they noticed each other, and he said, if you come back after lunch, I'll take you down to the picture collection and show you I want to show you some Cézannes. So that's where he got his introduction to Cézanne, and it turned out that this painter was Arshil Gorky. So Cézanne was an early influence, of course.
Yeah, the reason I brought it up is because there remains something in his paintings about the way Cézanne put paint on, and these carefully enunciated brush strokes, often a series of parallel strokes, and you find when you look close at some of the Helikers that he's putting paint on in a very similar way. I mentioned in the catalog essay, it may seem a little far-fetched, but that he came from 2 generations of stonemasons. And it seemed to me that there was a workmanlike way, a sense of order. There's no, you look at his paintings, there's nothing extraneous. Every brushstroke falls into place just right, as you might build you know, a brick wall or put stones together. It just, one of the things that, you know, when thinking about writing a catalog essay for this show, one of the things that really struck me was that responsibility for each touch of paint, carefully thought out. Not to mention, of course, his understanding of color, particularly of relationship of values. If you look at a painting like this, you don't see a lot of, you know, strong primary color, but there's so much richness in just the subtle variations of the tones in that work. And yet he's not above putting a very bright touch of paint. You look, not just the red shirt of the boy in the center, but there's a bright touch of red right there on the side of the leg. And I've seen that in other paintings. In fact, there's a painting, Patricia, that came up at auction that I sent you an image of it because I said it couldn't be a Heliker. It had this big splash of red down in one side. He said, "Oh yes, that's definitely a Heliker." So he didn't avoid color.
Well, he uses the red ground a lot. You can see it, right? And it's a foil for these beautiful sort of tones of blue that he loved. And certainly, it's one of the things that makes them pop. That's for sure. By the way, I'm going to quickly say this so I don't forget. If you haven't bought a copy of the catalog for this show with Martica's essay, it's one of the best essays you'll ever read about how a painting is made. Whatever you think about the paintings themselves, she really is right there within the painting and gives you a sense of how Heliker was putting the paint on. So it's a superb essay.
Well, it's right there to be seen. But I learned a lot from teaching 30 years in an art school. So I'm sure I learned more than my students ever from me when I was teaching art history. I also, Patricia, I mentioned briefly, and we didn't resolve this question, the impact of music, because during the 40s, Heliker lived with Martin Brown, who was a pianist and a composer, and through him was involved in, became very close friends for a time with John Cage and Lou Harrison, and who had studied with Carl Ruggles. And so he knew a lot about avant-garde music in the 40s, and he continued to be friends with Cage and also with the dancer, Merce Cunningham. I see, and maybe stretching a point, a lot of connection with musical composition in Heliker's painting. He wrote at one point how much he disliked romantic music and how he loved Handel and Bach and early music, which was, as Patricia mentioned when we were talking, something that composers were researching in the 40s and influential. But I think the way he seems to have a structure in mind. If you look from painting to painting, it's more obvious in the still lifes, like the one over there or this one, a kind of grid, almost like a measure in music. And that, I think that that's one of the things that enables him to paint these very organized works without being dependent on looking at the subject matter. He has an idea about form and structure, and I love the way he composes his still lifes, so that you have these wonderful different planes, but you see very clear, almost laundry-like divisions in the way the painting is put together, and also, of course, very rich in terms of often you're looking from one room into another, or you're looking out a window, and so you have a painting within a painting, like this one, the view from the window, and they're just very perfect. They exemplify the kind of harmony that he said was his goal in art.
Well, William Maxwell was a great friend, the writer.
Oh, really?
William Maxwell, yeah. Mm-hmm. And he had owned a still life of Heliker's, and he says in the documentary, which you can stay and see after this if you're interested, he says, the Impressionists painted light, but Jack paints air. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference in the paintings between inside air and outside air. Mm-hmm. And often he'll open a window like this in the interior, and then Maxwell says in this charming way, well, he says, but darned if I know how he does it. But he also said there's nothing literal in these paintings, and I think that's, of course, Maxwell's a great writer, a great critic. He said they're so unliteral, and I think that's an important distinction to make. He's interested in the fact that there's a subject here, but he's never literal. Mm-hmm. He's never illustrative, and I think that's an important thing to say. Whether it's stonemasonry or music that's coming through, I don't know.
You notice when he paints figures, he draws a kind of veil over the face. You barely see features, sometimes not even at all. And he doesn't want you to focus on, who is that, or where is it, he wants you to feel the whole thing. So he avoids that sharp, detail. And he also often, I'm trying to see it, well, particularly in this painting, he avoids the final edge. He'll put in the forms, and then he will take a brush and draw over it. But it's always ambiguous. I mean, the edge breaks. He's not a hard edge painter, and I think that's one of the things that helps one feel that that figure, dog, building, whatever, is part of a totality. And some of that brush line, this one down at the end here, lovely, in the way that works over and afterwards.
This painting in particular, of course, is a little more. It's a self-portrait, but again, he's probably not looking in a mirror. It's a sensation of himself, what it's like to feel like himself, and there are a lot of late self-portraits, and and they're always images of a state of being. Sometimes they're very sad. I think he feels that it's sad to get old. And that's in them. But now a painting like this one, which is a later one, if you look at those marks, he did have what was called an essential tremor. It's something that Poussin also had at the end of his life. And it's the very last part of the documentary film shows that when he's drawing. And his hand shook quite a bit, actually. So you can see what happens is that the line gets more calligraphic. It's more, I always say more Zen-like, and then he's, when he touches the canvas, it's very sure. But when he's approaching the canvas, it's trimmer. You know?
Interesting.
But he knows where he wants the mark to go. So this in particular, I think you can sort of see that quality here. And I don't think that's, however, I don't think that's what makes the line broken, as you were saying. I have another little passage I'd like to read about this by Jed Pearl, who was a student of Heliker's and who's written eloquently on Heliker. He admired him greatly. And he talks about this also a little bit. He says, when you're an artist, knowing a lot is often less important than knowing the exact limits of what you know. Now, he's writing here actually about Nell Blaine and Heliker in a review, but he said, they both take an almost clinical interest in the ineffable. They have a pretty sure sense of when being inexact is the only way to be exact. When I look at one of Heliker's paintings, I often find myself wondering why he's given a resolute outline to one object and glanced over the one right next to it. And then I realized that it's the very process of wondering about such things that makes the picture breathe. So I think that's also true of some of these figures that don't have faces, you know, that actually to have been too literal about who it was would have changed the sensation of the whole. I think he knows what he's doing. He's very sophisticated.
There's one more thing that I would like to say that's more general than applying specifically to Heliker. A curator from the University of Texas lives up the shore from me, and she happened to be at my house yesterday, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, and I had this catalog on the table, and I said I was going to talk about it. And she said, well, I really don't like figurative art, but they're very nice. And she's an art historian. She's probably 45 or 50, and she curates, puts together shows for the campus of the University of Texas, and they commission art, and it's all very trendy and so on. But it bothered me very much because I thought somebody who was serious about art, a curator, art historian, whatever, would have to understand that there is room for different ways of painting, different modes of expression. Not everything has to be abstract. At one time, the Heliker's work reflects an aspect of the time in which he lived. You would not put him in any other period looking at these works, just as much as a decoming woman or something else. And it's something that continues to bother me, the way people hang labels on things and think that there's only one thing for one time and so forth. So I hope that eventually the general public will come to understand that Heliker is just as valid for his time as the most any pop artist or photorealist or actually. I went to the Portland Museum. Have any of you seen the Richard Estes show that's the Portland Museum? It's a delightful show. I mean, I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. But there is a painting there of people in a boat where you see the wake behind the boat and you see the figures and so on. And I just thought of it in connection with this Heliker because I get much more of the sensation of what it would be like to sitting in the stern of that boat with the wake behind and the wonderful depths of the water and so on that I got from Richard Estes' beautifully, meticulously painted figures in the boat. So if you get to the Portland Museum, you can see what you think about it.
That's a great, I haven't seen that painting. But every time I take the ferry to Great Cranberry from Manson, the Cranberry Cove ferry, it's a boat that has a square back like this one, and there they are. I just, it's the sensation of being on the boat.
So I wonder if any of you have any questions or comments. And did you? I mean,
no, that's great. I'd like to hear from them.
Did he have any interest in unicorn?
Not that I'm aware of, but that's a good question.
This picture has, in some ways,
Well, it's a good question because that's another figurative artist for whom the abstract structure is very important, and also coloration is similar.
How about you, Norma?
Well, I met John Heliker probably around somewhere in the late 1950s. And I used to go to Courthouse Gallery frequently. And I saw his shows, and I didn't know him well. I don't know how many people really knew him well. He was very reticent about talking with people, and he had to get to know you. But as you both were speaking so well about him and his work and so on, it made me think about something that I think about with artists, any artist. And it was a real wonderful experience just to sit here, not only to hear you both speak, but as you spoke once in a while, my eyes would dart around a little bit around the room, not to be impolite, but to listen and look. And the wonderful thing about Jack Heliker's work is that he was always Jack Heliker in the first place. Another thing about his work for me is that no matter which picture, whether it was an early work or the middle work or at the end, toward the end of his life, there is always the thread of uniqueness and of the artist's work of Jack Heliker that went from painting to painting. He was consistent in the fact, and he certainly never painted, you know, for the tourist trade. I hope I'm not offending anyone. I don't think so. He can always tell his work. If you walk into a gallery or something and you're looking at wonderful work by wonderful artists, because there are many, and you see a work by Jack Heliker, you look and say, oh, what a lovely Heliker that is. And that's something I've always felt about his work over the many, many, many years. And I know him through his work more than as a person, but I think I have a feeling of him, and because he is his work, and the work is his. So, you know, it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. He was a very shy person.
He was.
He was deeply shy.
Yes.
And modest.
Beautiful show.
Compassionate.
So who else? Any question or comment?
Were they done from sketches? If you worked in the studio, were these sketches first and then painted in the studio?
Well, he sometimes went out with a sketchbook, and he talks about that, and he might make a note in the landscape. But he also said sometimes he would just go out and sit on the shore at Cranberry, and then try to come back, and then begin by just putting some colors down, trying to recreate the sensation of what it felt like to be on the shore. So even though, you know, he drew all the time, David Little here remembers his showing two small sketchbooks to him when he visited with Jack, And he said to me, "I'd love to see those 2 sketchbooks." And I said, "Well, David, there's 600 left in the archive. In fact, there's a whole project to give these sketchbooks to, some of the sketchbooks to institutions so that faculty could use them." It might be hard to put my hands on those exact 2 that you remember, but we might be able to find some others anyway. But he drew all the time, constantly, and he drew from memory a lot.
I think it's interesting that what you're talking about him doing it from memory, because we have one of the artists here that we represent, Scott Baltz, and that's how he does his landscapes, right, Scott?
Yes.
Yeah, he primarily goes out and sits and experiences it, and sometimes it may be years before it transpires onto a canvas, so it's really interesting. But I was wondering, Martica, if you might comment on this little landscape right here. I don't know if you've looked at it close up, but the fog and the tree on the right is very elusive and woven in between the fog and the atmosphere, and it's sort of fleeting, that tree on the right. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you had any comments on that. And even in this big one here, there's a lot of fleeting, you know, the dock and the boathouse are more defined, as you were saying earlier. One thing would be defined, and then he sort of skips over this right-hand part as if the people were.
And the skies are amazing. In this one, you almost have the feeling that the fog is lifting. I mean, don't you? Or maybe it's coming in, but there's something happening atmospheric in that painting.
Yeah, it's interesting how he treated the tree there.
You know, one of the reasons that their home on Great Cranberry has become such a wonderful place for artists to work is that the weather is constantly changing. The tides, it's located on a tidal pool, so those of you who know the tides in Maine, how important they are, it's never the same 2 hours at a time. And so even though there's a great continuity, it's never boring for artists. They're constantly, you know. So I think, you know, and that's what Robert LaHotan knew. It was really his idea to leave the property. He wanted it to be possible for artists to continue to come to the island to paint. There had been a really important community of artists the whole second half of the 20th century who were there: Bill Kingbush, Gretna Campbell, Ashley Bryan, Emily Nelligan, Dorothy Eisner, a wonderful community of other artists who've been there, Charles Wadsworth. So he wanted it to be possible for artists to come. And so he asked us to try to do this. And he said it won't be easy, and it hasn't been, but we've done it for a while.
I like what you said about the connection with music, because when I was looking at this picture, that to me that explains that white flowered sack to me. It's like a musical accent, yet it's placed very carefully in one particular spot. Timing, yeah.
You know, in the film too, I talk about the role of memory, because I had the experience that he came to my loft in New York one Sunday for lunch with a group of people. And, you know, we just had lunch. And he went home and he made a drawing. And then he made a painting based on that drawing. But he did it all from memory. And it wasn't until his next show that I saw the painting. And
Lunch at Patricia's?
Well, yeah, there's a table. He changed things, of course. But it was more the memory and the sensation of figures in space, you know.
There's a lot to look at in each one. I think there's a film. The film is being shown in the other room. Is that right, Carol?
We're finished. Yes, the film will be shown in the other building. We'll probably take a 15-minute break, so if somebody wants to have some refreshments and stretch their legs.
It's a documentary that we were able to make the last year that he was painting on Cranberry, which was 1995. And so, you know, he's shown in New York and in his studio in Cranberry.
How long is the movie?
In 95.
I think it's like 20 minutes, maybe?
Maybe 30.
Maybe 30, 20 or 30 minutes, not very long.
Is it
Is it upstairs or
It's downstairs.
It's
We
great.
have a chairs over there too. But I would love to.
Cranberry Island also?
There's 5 Cranberry Islands. But there's Little Cranberry and Great Cranberry.
So he was on Great.
He was on Great Cranberry.
I would like to
And
thank,
you can see some of that. You can go there and visit.
Oh, yes, yes.
I'd like to thank Patricia Bailey and Martica Sawin for this lovely talk and lecture today, and Jed Pearl, who I also worked with to put together the show from the Heliker-LaHotan Foundation. Thank you.